I would say what we do as theatre and performance historians, as critical media historians, is try to understand how societies think through performance, how they think through art, how they sort of don't use this in a decorative sense or in a sense that sort of considers this as just illustrating a social reality. But it is an attempt to describe and to show how societies require certain forms of embodiment, representation, and narration to get really things done. And one of the aspects I find very helpful is a statement by Arjuna Padurai that he already made in 1996 in Modernity at Large, where he said, well, he tried to distinguish between fantasy and imagination. And he makes an argument for the importance of imagination. He says, I quote, "The second distinction is between imagination and fantasy. The idea of fantasy carries with it the inescapable connotation of thought divorced from projects and actions, and it also has a private, even individualistic sound about it. The imagination, on the other hand, has a projective sense about it, the sense of being a prelude to something of expression, whether aesthetic or otherwise. Fantasy can dissipate, but the imagination, especially when collective, can become the fuel of action." So this is what is at the core of our interest in, at least from my point of conviction. You can have other convictions. I'm not a missionary, but I sort of try to make my case. In my case is to say, this is what is at the core of our discipline. This is what we are good at. This is our superpower. To understand collective imagination and how they are produced, how they are implemented in society, and how they gain a Sitz im Leben through the embodiment of performance. It is one aspect to have an abstract idea, and it's not just a question of broadcasting it, it's not just a question of propagating it, but it's a question on how do you make people of feeling the reality of the concept you have? How do you implement it in people's lives? And this ever so often happens through media representation, through theater, and through performance. And this is why I find Padurai's emphasis on the projective sense of imagination so utterly important. And this is why it's not of no consequence how certain stories are told, how certain bodies are represented, because these are preludes to actions that might not follow afterwards. But it helps us to understand how this is conceptualized. So Tracy Davis and I have suggested this concept of critical media history, and I sort of will just try to emphasize some of the thoughts of this concept. And the first one is exactly this focus on collective imagination. I quote, "Critical media history focuses on processes of formatting or transformating the experience of performance and forms of media. Here, critical recognizes that concepts constitute and continually build the ways in which an audience spectates and values a genre, style, media form, or other tradition, as well as the factors that inspire anyone to perform in capacity and permutation of this concept," unquote. So critical here does not mean, as in the everyday language usage, critical in terms of a specific political attitude, but critical rather in the sense of we have to check the concepts in which we talk, because they have serious implications. And they form the way in which we speak about certain cultural phenomena. Theatre and performative practices are a vital part of experiencing and expressing public space in institutions, and they thereby arise in other arts and media, social expressions and gatherings, persisting as an important contributor to and catalyst for other developments. Especially media historians are sometimes driven by this tacit impulse of permanent technological evolution and development. digital representation is more effective than the traditional photorealistic representation. Social media is faster than the traditional newspaper. But this kind of excludes the idea of theater and performance as an embodied form of cultural interaction in a specific site to a specific time, and the impact of this idea and concept that also transpires to other forms of media. And finally, the catch phrase is theater history is performance history. Especially in the US-American tradition, there's a long tradition of anxiously trying to divide theater from performance, going back to Austin and some of his problems with theater. But I think it's important to do away with that distinction. Theater and performance history sort of overlap significantly. They don't fall into one, they don't conflate completely, but for sure there is no theater history that is not also part of the larger concept of performance history. And I think this is important to recognize. And if you allow me to add a fourth thought, that would be historical thinking is critical thinking. To think historically does not only mean to talk about objects of the past. It means to think in the constellations of contingencies. It means to acknowledge that semantic horizons are limited and that they are specific. And that sometimes we need to sort of put our considerations, especially in this limitedness, to be able to make a specific or to gain a specific insight. And as you will see, my unresponded LAFO diagrams carries on, because this is how we tried to sort of capture the interaction of critical media history by defining three poles. There is the question of the apparatus and the materiality, and the practices that are inscribed into this materiality. A marionette has a specific kind to be moved. A rock puppet has a specific kind to be moved. A musical instrument has a specific kind to be played. You can do it otherwise. You might destroy the object by doing it otherwise. But sort of this is an important interdependence. And finally, the concept of aesthesis means not just the question of aesthetic perception. So this is not just about art, but this is about the way we perceive. This is the arte spectandi I talked about before. This is something we have to learn. We have to learn how to watch a movie. We have to learn how to see a puppet show. We have to learn how to make sense of a dance performance. It's not obligatory. You can do it always in other ways and come to different results, but there is an interdependence between these three poles. And of course, they are not, comprehensive or totally all-encompassing, but they for sure invite a consideration, or they allow us to formulate questions on different levels. If we are conscious of these three poles, we're able to talk about where is the aesthesis in a specific constellation, where are the practices and what are the implications for other parts. So let me finish this part with a prospect. What are the challenges of theater and performance history? I think the core challenge is to develop a genuinely polyphonic form of writing history, to hear as many voices as possible, not to dismiss single voices, not to dismiss certain sources. That means to pay attention to anecdotes and gossip, as far as we can get hold of it, as much as to police records. Of course, this does not mean that naively we take everything at face value, but sort of trying to be as as open to these different voices will allow us also to break hidden hegemonies that otherwise might be inscribed. It would also means that we need a language, and here semiotics or formalism for sure will come into play. It means that we need to find a language to talk about the specific conditions, to talk about material objects, practices, and discourse. So we cannot simply borrow large concepts and implement them on poor, small performances, but it sort of rather has to work the other way around. And I think here, really, it's not accidental or not just rhetoric that I talk about finding a language. As I said, thinking historically means to think through contingencies, constellations, rather than a longue durée evolution. And this means also, many of my students keep telling me, well, I'm rather interested in the contemporary, which I think is totally fine. But this does not mean that we cannot think about the contemporary as historians, to sort of question the conditions under which the contemporary unfolds, and to ask for these contingencies. And I think this is really a liberating step that sort of gives us a broader perspective and a broader horizon. Media history of theater and performance, is for sure a migratory history. It is a history that moves across borders, that moves across cultures, that sort of has a very strong tendency to be part of interaction between heterogeneous groups. But this does not mean that it doesn't have what Stephen Greenblatt has called a sense of rootedness. It might present itself as something that is centuries old, that is something that always has been there. But this is an effect that is created, it's a discursive moment. It's important to acknowledge that, but not to mistake this for a historical analysis. Media history is the history of collective imagination. It's the history of practices, of performances, and watching them, and the circulation of people, ideas, narratives, and techniques. It is absolutely impossible to see whether there's an immediate connection between the decapitation performance at the Bartholomew Fair in 1582 in London and the one in Constantinople. I will never find the trace. I will never find any further information about this Kingfield, and I'm happy to have a name, but the name will not come into a full person. But to see the structural similarities, to be able to describe that it's the same trick on a physical basis, that it requires some dexterity, some training to be capable of doing that, is the first step of being able to see that this is a constellation that is not accidental, that there must be some black box that I might not be able to describe in all specificities, but that I cannot leave out of my equation. It is important to me, and again, this is not just a small scholarly feud, but sort of really sort of has to do with the claim I think we make, is to understand that this form of history is not just another subcategory, a special history of the larger field of art history or whatsoever. But this is an attempt to describe how societies think through representation, performative, theatrical, media representation, and to get to that point. And to understand that theater and performance is not just entertainment. This is not what people do after they've done the basic structure real work, as Grand Uncle Charlie would say, but this is how societies think. This is how they project themselves, how they relate themselves vis-a-vis the world, how they get a sense of space and geography, of history, of their social interrelations, of the integrity of their body, the integrity of their social identity, and this is also how it can be changed. And if you follow that perspective, just as a thought experiment, you'll find very soon multiple examples from your everyday life where sort of it's very evident that people try to change the collective imagination. If you're looking, for example, look at the current president of the United States, because he is forcefully trying to project himself and to change the collective imagination of the political system. Here you can see in real time how the change of the collective imagination changes a political system at its core. Probably not irreparably, but for sure at its core. So far for that. Questions?
Could you elaborate on
We have this small
please elaborate on migratory history and sense of rootedness, because one of your earlier slides also talked about that itinerant performances were a part of theatre history.
I'm deeply convicted that theatre and performance are so important because they own a specific mobility that other art forms don't have. And that this mobility is an important element in their historical development. And that even at times, if you look at this 1582 festival of Murad III, this is to me such a striking example because if you look at the political history, this is a period of time when Murad is fighting the Persians on one end of his empire and the Christian League on the other. And they all come together for these 55 days, for this festivity. They all watch the same performances. And for sure, if you look at the descriptions, the performers are from various social groups, in particular Armenians, Jews, and Greeks. So rather sort of marginalized groups of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, they were circulating. And they were building networks. Carnival in Venice in the 15th and 16th century was usually opened with a stunning performance called Il Turco Volante. And it was a Turkish performer who, from the spire of St. Mark, walked all the way down to the Laguna as a stunning act. And it was important for everyone that this was a Turkish performer. It was recognized as something that is present. So I think we really have to fight against the idea of the homogeneity of territory, linguistic spaces, and social spaces, but rather to acknowledge that this kind of mobility was always a part of human history. And it's not an invention of the 19th, the 20th, or the 21st century. It's rather a question how we deal with it and how we sort of acknowledge this history. But at the same time, this is a point I take from Stephen Greenblatt, but at the same time we know that there is a desire for societies to create an autochthonous history, to create a history that says we have been here since the beginning of times. My own hometown of Cologne is extremely prone to that idea. So we have a proverb in Cologne, we're saying, if you do something twice, it's a tradition, the third time it's a custom. But since everyone knows that we are rather relaxed with our customs, right? So there's a famous puppetry tradition in Cologne, the so-called Hennessian-Theater. And if you ask people from Cologne, they will say, oh, this is really an old tradition. It's been here from time immemorial. It's an intrinsic part of our civic culture. And it is, for sure. But it's an invention from the year 1805, We know who he did it, we know why he did it, we know how he did it. It's 200 years old. That's nice, but it's not time immemorial. It's 200 years. I can remember that. I haven't been there. Whatever you think. But it for sure, sort of, it's man-made. But it attributes to the sense of rootedness. So rootedness, the idea of autochthonous identity, is part of something societies produce. They produce as an act of reassurance. They produce to assure themselves of who they are and why they are together. And if you allow me to talk a little bit more about the Hennessyne Theater, what is interesting is that the Hennessyne Theater emerges at a point in time when Cologne undergoes one of the most drastic changes in its social structure. The number of inhabitants multiplies by 4. So that means the people who attended these shows have not been Cologne people from the beginning of times, and they knew that. But attending the performance allowed them to be part of this sense of rootedness. It had an enormous inclusive character. So singing is part of the show, and sort of weird form of sit dancing, I will not try to describe to you, is part of the show. So it really means that you arrive in the city with all your heart. And this is why, and this is a phenomenon we know from other European cities at the same time, sort of that suddenly there pop up performances that project a sense of rootedness, that project a sense of what does it mean to be a Berlin person, to be a Darmstadt person, or to be a Munich person. And it's an invitation, and it's compensatory for the actual social change that is happening. That's what I try to say here.
Excuse me. I'm quite intrigued by your this part of lecture. I have two set of questions. One is like your take on media history. When you say media history, do you, I mean, specific about theater, or you, I mean, speaking in a broader way? Because why I'm thinking about media history because I have heard, I mean, I've read one of the articles by, one of the writings by Ravi Sundaram. He says, now we are in the world, like I have been trained as an art historian, okay? So my way of looking at things, the images, everything, is being, I look through the prism of art history. But now, I mean, when I say art history, especially when I say Indian art history, it's very much narrative based, narrative. We are being trained to read narratives. But now there is so much information, like now we are information citizen. We all are information citizen. Every day we are, looking at, information. So how you, try to make your intervention, through media. When you say media history, only for theater, but some other sorts of art also. Okay, this is the one. And the second question is the last one, Weltbild. I was thinking of, the idea of Bildung, Humboldt. So Humboldt also, he claims that, we have to look beyond, and the whole thing comes up in the reaction of French Revolution, the violence of French Revolution, and therefore there is a new way of thinking which emerged in Germany to look something beyond, through the idea of culture, Kultur. Mm-hmm. So and then there is a Bildungsroman, then looking at other way, look at the world in a different way, not through the Enlightenment kind of value. So how do you react on?
Yeah, thank you. I strongly believe that theater and performance are part of media history, and that we should read theater and performance not as something that is categorically different from other forms of representation, but rather in sort of interdependent interrelation. So I think that what defines theater and performance partly depends on the surrounding media that coexist along with theater and performance. The sense of the physical body and performance relates to other availabilities of physical representations. And I think it's very important, and this is actually sort of the claim we try to make with critical media history, is to say, let's stop separating theater history from other forms of representation. For way too long, theater and performance scholars sort of try to say what we do is something completely different. No, it's not. It's not. There are serious fields of intersection. For example, when it comes to dramaturgical questions, to questions of conceiving of the actor's presentation of a character, where we have much to bring to the table. So we shouldn't be too modest. But at the same time, it's important to understand that theater and performance respond to other forms of media abilities. Sometimes explicit, by integrating them as part of their show. Think of, for example, the German director Erwin Piscator, who included film projections in his shows. Sometimes on a more implicit way, by, for example, refusing that. And I think this also is true for this is also true for the question of how they sort of relate in specific times. I'm sorry. The example I'm thinking of is the following. There's a German director, Karin Bayer, and she produced a show of Richard III, I think in 21 or 22. And this was the first show after the pandemic that the Salzburg Festspiele could show with a full house. And we all, as spectators, as scholars, even professionally, sort of thought about the possibility to translate theater and performance to Zoom and other digital forms of representation. And I think this went fairly well. But when Karin Bayer, Karin Henkel, not Karin Bayer, when Karin Henkel presented this Richard on a bare stage with only some light bulbs looking like stars, you could sense how mesmerized the audience was. You know, after all these 2 years of intensified digitization, of translating performance into different media, finding new ways to do theater in different forms. And I think many of them have been great and should be carried on. But clearly, Karin Henkel made a decision saying, I want to emphasize the physical co-presence of the actor and the audience in this moment. So, and to this extent, I think it's part of the media history. I also think I have, and this is less ironic than it will sound, I have a deep admiration for German Kunstgeschichte. But I also have issues with them. Because my revered colleagues from Kunstgeschichte, which is at least a proper art history, I mean, sort of, we are doing theater and performance, well, can you juggle, right? So we're always a little bit like the dirty cousin, right? But art historians restrict themselves to the idea that there is a fixed concept of the image. To give you one example, maybe two, one of the weirdest images I've ever seen is a depiction of the crucifixion in the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in Cologne. Mm-hmm. Because it's a painted image and someone installed wooden hats on Christ and the other characters. And if you think of creepiness, high up. Very, very creepy. Whoa. Really. Ugh. Does not help the cause. But if you start to think about that this image was not on eye level in plain museum light, but was slightly above the spectator who might have kneeled in front of it, and it might have been lit by a flickering candle, you see that it gains a momentum, a kind of movement doesn't turn it into a moving image. I'm not making the cause for pre-cinematic practices here. But clearly this image was part of a larger practice. Something was inscribed into this image. Something I can only perceive as creepiness. But clearly that meant it was positioned, it had a Sitz im Leben in a specific tradition that sort of had an additional allure to that. So I think if we don't fall into this contemporaneist trap to think of media as only everything that's digital or electronic or at least printed, but sort of rather think of the entire catalog of techniques of representation, we really get a very different image here. And I think we also will discover completely new fields of conversation between art historians and performance historians. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
The question about Bildung. Yeah, I mean, sort of this is a little bit, so the concept of Weltbild sort of is something in the German tradition that comes from a philosophy that says we need to project an image of the world in front of us because the world is always too big for us. We don't have an instinct like animals to respond to everything that's happening, but we require sort of the translation into another medium to get our hands on what is going on. And I think this is what I thought of with Weltbild. I'm reluctant about this idea of building. I think it's tempting, but I need to give it more thought, because the Humboldtian concept of Bildung sort of is rather the formation of a subjectivity
Yes.
in all its complexity.
Yes.
And it's a very interior process. So the concept of Bildung comes with quite a burden
Yes.
that I would be cautious to take on
Yeah.
as well at the moment.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's an online question. It's to what extent do the media or mediation networks of performances and its own material inform or affect the conceptions of corporeality and embodiment within performances? How does performance studies archive and flag them to make them relevant and inform contemporary constellations of performance studies?
Not a small one. So I think we know that in Shakespeare's time, all female parts of the plays were performed by male actors, the so-called boy actors, pre-pubертarian boys who sort of performed the female parts. It's hard to imagine that this does not have an effect on how people thought about the female body. And actually we know how people thought about the female body, because as soon as female actors appear on the stage, there's a specific type of people who almost run amok. And the argument is, that's very funny. How shall the male spectator concentrate at all? I love that. Yeah? How shall the male spectator concentrate at all? So clearly, sort of, this means that underlying this discourse is an idea about the female body of being, I don't know, such an super erotic center of gravity that the male brain simply clicks off and loses all the threads. On the other hand, the aforementioned production by Karin Henkel had one peculiarity that I haven't told you, and that is that the part of Richard III was played by a female actress. And it's a wonderful and stunning performance. If someone down the line will find time, I'll try to show a small clip, because there's one moment when you can see how she alters her body into a male body, how she becomes a male character. She suddenly starts to move differently. She wears her shoulders differently. She's not overdoing anything. She's no grimacing. She's not changing the costume. Actually, she even has a costume that sort of clearly shows her breasts, so she's very evidently readable as a female body. But through her gesture, through her mimic, through the way she talks, she suddenly conjures a very vivid image of a male person. So I think theater and performance studies are in this double relationship to social categories and habitus. On the one hand, the performance is informed by social ideas about, for example, gender and sex, but at the same time, it can make them visible. And it sort of can make them sort of apparent. They become, they sort of get into our field of sight. We suddenly see what is the difference. We suddenly see how a certain tone, certain gesture is very subtle. It's really very subtle. But it's so subtle that one of my colleagues says, this is what I will use in every gender studies class I'll teach from here on. Because it clearly sort of gave the opportunity to see how small changes sort of relate to that. And I think this is the potential of theater and performance as a space, as a social space, where these fluidities are possible. More questions?
Maybe I can ask one.
Yes, sure.
Could you just elaborate a bit on, you did refer to the broad spectrum approach of Schechner and other kind of work. Now, one of the things that performance studies have done, like you kind of highlighted, is to make theater studies into performance, a larger, wider category of performance, yep. Broad spectrum. Now, when you make it into part of media studies, which is even larger, such a wide kind of category, what do we gain and what do we lose in certain ways? Like, what is the gain in terms of, or what is it distinct from a very, very good performance studies broad spectrum approach, which would kind of involve a lot more things. So, but what are we gaining in being subsumed under such a wide thing of media studies? What is the specificity?
I think my response would be twofold. On the one hand, we are able to acknowledge the importance of certain forms of theater and performance that we now tend to marginalize. As, for example, puppetry, shadow play, but also the interlinkage, for example, between, in the early modern period, magic lantern projections and shadow plays. And it's very evident. So this was one of the impulses that brought me to this idea, is that I was interested in the history of shadow plays in Europe, and we know they must have appeared in the 1670s. But this is exactly about the same time that the magic lantern with projecting glass slides is also coming into play. But since magic lanterns are the territory for media historians, no one ever thought that it might have been interrelated to the appearance of shadow plays. But if you follow that path, you see that the early modern period was very concerned with the idea of ethereal bodies, so bodies that don't have a physical reality. So if I take them under the larger umbrella of media history, sort of I suddenly can position theater and performance much more precisely vis-a-vis neighboring forms of other forms of representation. And I can do away with this, I think, naive idea of an evolutionary logic that every form of representation needs to become a fully fleshed version of its own, so that film needs to become film history. No, I think film, for the better part of its history, has been closely interlinked with theater history. And it's worth to see the two vis-a-vis each other. And there are many questions where we gain when we don't pretend that we need to bridge a categorical difference, but sort of that we are talking about the things in the same realm. So this is one aspect. The other one is that I really tried, or I really, there's a strong impulse to get theater and performance studies out of this defensive position vis-a-vis other media. So I think the idea that proper media are only digital media or electronic media or printed media sort of is so reductionist, and always pretends that theater and performance is just an anachronism few people sort of carry on. But I think it's the other way around. In many cases, theater and performance is the laboratory that helps people understand the potentialities of new media forms of representation, either in the affirmative or in the critical way. And I think, getting a better sense of these interdependencies, this is why it really makes sense to put theater and performance history under this broader umbrella term of media history. If I sort of may formulate it as a provocation, I would say I'm very envious of Stephen Greenblatt because of the first sentence of Shakespearean Negotiations. I began with the desire to speak with the dead. I think that's a wonderful first line. And for years I've been torturing myself. I mean, I was way too young when he wrote that sentence, but still you feel kind of disenfranchised. But I think what I start to understand is I'm not interested in speaking with the dead. I want to see how people thought of themselves, how they imagined the world around them, how they built, this collective imagination that created a geography that allowed them to act, that created a sense of their own body, their social roles, and this is not restricted to a single form of medium. And I think for the better part of theater history, there was no extra singular category of theater, but for most part of it, it was part of a larger media continuum in which it positioned, and many of the actors sort of zigzagged around different forms of profession. Does it make sense?
While dealing with your fifth point, I just want to ask that how do we account for the tension between dominant media structure, which a kind of control or shape collective narratives, and between the counter publics who resist or appropriate or kind of reconfigure these media practices. So in what way do the practices of performance negotiate with this dialectics of hegemony and subversion?
So, first of all, I think it's important that and this is why I emphasize so much this literacy of media usage, that we recognize there's an agency for the spectator. So, for example, Stuart Hall in this essay, Decoding and Encoding, made the argument saying, we mustn't think of those who watch a TV series as passive objects on which something is imprinted, but we have to acknowledge that they have a capacity to build counter narratives and to choose and pick and organize them in different ways. So I think this has to do with trying to understand how these agencies manifest themselves, also in what form of practices they result, and also how different channels suddenly become much more malleable than they appear in the first place. So what I mean by that is, and I'm not sure that's a good example. So if it's a bad one, let's kick it. Okay. If you look at the portfolio Netflix offers, I recently discovered, and I simply wasn't aware of that there's a large number of Nigerian movies present on Netflix. And this is true for movies from other countries as well. So obviously, while traditional media studies sort of would assume that this is, a capitalist channel run by consumer capitalism, that it sort of projects a specific kind of films, and of course they make a choice. But obviously, the digital channel or the digital nature of the channel allows them for a broader variety that sort of we haven't seen previously. So many of these, at least that's the case for the situation in Germany, many of these Nigerian movies were literally sold under the counter of small kiosks, and you needed to know where they are, sort of you needed to be a part of that network. This obviously has changed. This doesn't change the hegemonic structure per se, but it kind of grants an agency to the spectator. So I think this helps us to identify where and how hegemonic asymmetries are acted out, and how people sort of are kept without agency in certain constellations. Have I responded to your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just had a kind of a methodological question, because I agree with you. I mean, as someone who's not from theatre studies at all, I find the proposition quite compelling, that work. But I was also thinking, is there something particular about this, say this last 5-10 years, especially with the coming of the digital, like, is that what is also, because in the example you gave, like about the performance after COVID, right? Like, and that kind of the sort of very present forms of the digital during the COVID period, but what we see overall, right? So is there a way, because we see the same kind of arguments within cinema studies also,
Yeah.
right? Like that we cannot isolate it as separate. So what do you think these new media forms, what impact are they making on methodologies of research itself in other fields? Yeah.
I'm so grateful for this question, because other than what you will see from me in the next days, I'm also an early modernist. And actually, I have developed these models out of my work on early modern media constellations. So I'm rather bad at the contemporary, as one can see with my weird examples. But sort of it really comes out of substantial work in a period when, through the invention of printing, through the arrival of specific kinds of apparatuses like peep boxes, magic lanterns, sort of suddenly the landscape of representation changed evidently. And I felt theatre history sort of lacks a language and concepts to describe this impact. So one part of myself would say, well, as an early modernist, I'm not too worried about the digital. We saw the advent of printing. That was a change, right? At the same time, I don't want to steal away from that question, but I want to say this is exactly the attempt not to be contemporary. This is exactly sort of saying, no, this is an attempt that helps to describe different constellations whenever we have, or whenever we want to describe the interdependency and interaction between different forms of representation. I think something that changes with the digital media, and from my perspective that we see dramatically, is that, for example, a political concept that was very present in the German discourse is this idea of the public sphere by Habermas, the Öffentlichkeit. So our entire thinking of democracy depended on this idea of the public sphere. And what we are seeing is a structure of communication where there is no longer a public sphere. So Germany holds general elections tomorrow. And I have never in my life seen such a massive attempt to influence an election from the outside. So I don't know whether you've heard the name of Elon Musk. Of course you have. Yeah? Elon Musk tries to push a right-wing neo-fascist party. Just this morning he published spots on X. This is something that didn't exist before. And you realize that the political pundits, but also the political philosophers, sort of really, they lack words to describe this. They lack words to describe a society that seems to, I wouldn't say fall apart, I wouldn't go that far, but at least crumbles, because people live in bubbles in which they inform themselves. And someone coming from the outside, and even our juridical system fails, because that's illegal. Right? There's a law in Germany, you cannot make major donations during an election campaign to a party because it's a bad idea. I think that's a good law, right? But you see, here comes someone who, with the mere pressure of his digital existence, sort of pushes an agenda and tries to move an entire society to the right. And I realize, I kind of see, as many others do, we see what happens, but our ways to explain it or our ways to make sense of that, even less to have a strategy against that, are really very frail, if that makes sense. So sometimes as an early modernist you think, oh yeah, okay, there's plague and there's religious wars, but still no Elon Musk. And I think it's really interesting. I was only half joking. If you look at the way in which Mr. Trump is projecting his concept of power on a global scale, it's really interesting to look at the imagery that he sort of implies and try to push forward.
So Peter, I wanted to talk about polyphonic historiography, okay, and the framework which we're talking about, and while we are attentive to non-dominant voices and histories, but this framework also kind of is used by, some of the examples which you gave, right?
Yeah.
And how it converts into celebration of pluralism, and then it gets into the framework of neoliberalism, and then it can get into we can again get back to this high capitalism kind of a framework. So how do we differentiate? And the good example which you gave was with Netflix, right? So when you talk about that Nigerian films are available, so but the certain kind of, because it has to go into Netflix, there would be some kind of an deviation or some kind of an compromise which the Nigerian films will also go for, just to be part of that entire network of the films which come into Netflix. So so how do we kind of talk about this? How do we work with this? Because this polyphonic historiography, would this non-dominant voice still be heard, from that particular perspective? I'm just thinking.
One thing I like about the metaphor of polyphony is that it requires attentiveness to realize it. And allow me to give an example. You remember that I mentioned this woman who was thrown out when she was in labor. Her name was Katharina Felten. And we know her because her husband was a legendary director of a theater troupe, the famous Magister Johannes Felten. And Johannes Felten is well known and much appreciated by cultural historians because he's the first one who introduces Molière to the German stage. And he even had a degree from a university, so he has all the things we like. He's male, he knows French, and he has a degree. If you look closer into the history of Katharina Elisabeth, who in most reports is only known as the Widow Felten, die Witwe Felten, you discover that she's coming from a theater background. Her father was a principal already, and she probably has been on stage ever since she could walk. The famous Magister Felten sort of comes rather late to the table. He's in his early 20s when he marries Katharina Elisabeth. And then he takes over the troupe because this is a patriarchal society. So Katharina Elisabeth gets sidelined almost entirely in the history of this small troupe. And she gets even more sidelined because later bourgeois historians appreciate that someone tries to literarize the German stage. Whereas she is doing puppetry on the side, she's doing all sorts of performances, and she has several tricks. So what we know about her are complaints. But if we try to be attentive and sort of try to read these sources against the grain, we discover probably she knew the business. He was a scholar. Nothing against scholars, but have you met one? So he was probably completely impractical. She knew how to run a company. And she knew sort of that, for example, at a certain time when cash is low, it's better to do puppetry because you need less actors than with a regular stage. So developing a polyphonic history sort of means to pay attention to what is cut out or what is sidelined. That someone who is only the Widow Felten might be much more interesting and influential than we can see at first sight. The problem is, of course, that she also has left much less traces than her husband.
Yeah.
But once you start listening to that, once you realize there is a voice to listen to, you discover quite something. You never get the full picture, but at least you get, some sense. When the pandemic started, I busied myself with developing a certain kind of chronology of German puppetry in the 15th and 16th century. So I was reading all these 19th century positivistic theater histories and trying to find any traces of puppetry. And I came across the interesting line where one of the scholars said, it's astonishing to see, because one of the traces is people leave the mark when they submit an application for a permission to perform. And one of the scholars says, it's surprising to see how many of these applicants are female, usually driven in poverty by their husbands, brothers or fathers, desperate to run the company to not fall into poverty. And you think, but in a patriarchal society, these were the few women who ran a business of their own. Also the widow Felton. The husband dies 1694, I guess, and she carries on for another 20 years. Of course, no more milieu whatsoever, but she runs a theater for 20 years. So I think there's a little bit of a challenge in the concept of polyphony. And that says, listen to what is cut out. Listen to the fact that most of the performers at Murat's feast were Armenians or Jews, minorities in the Ottoman Empire. But obviously, they gained some kind of agency through performing there.
Yeah.
I do.
I just wanted to ask, there are many indigenous cultures, and for them, they don't have electronic gadgets. There are some places they don't have phones, or they are not connected to main media. So they have some theater practices. They are limited to their geographical area. And there are songs, costumes, and stories. They get entertained from them, and they are so much connected to them. They are emotionally connected to them, and there are rituals. So should we consider these practices also as a part of theater? And if yes, what measures should we take to give it a little space to all these theater practices, well to build? So yeah.
So in a different context, I've suggested the term media ecology, trying to emphasize that different modes of representation are interrelated, but also in a specific constellation. This is what I mean by contingency. So if there's a group that doesn't have electronic media, they still have different modes of representation that interrelate to each other. And of course, they probably are still aware that there are electronic or digital media, but they are in a distant constellation to that. So I think this metaphor of ecology is quite thought-provoking, to think about contingencies, but also to think in multiplicities of different forms of representation and how they interact. And something I like particularly about this idea of the ecology is also to say that one element in ecology A might have a different form and function in ecology B. So one of the big temptations of world histories of theater always has been to say, this is theater, and it's always the same. It varies in color and taste. But no, I would argue, no, you need to define the ecology, you need to define the paradigm, the continuum in which it happens, and then you will see the specificities. So that would be my response to that.
Any other questions?
I think we used the oxygen in the room. So I've been asked before about the slides. Amit and I will figure out a possibility that I sort of can make them available. I need to compress them a little bit because it's too large to send them out by email. Maybe we turn it into a PDF and it will be in the Dropbox so that you can get back to that. And also, my understanding of these 5 days is that they are not sort of closed chapters, but you carry on. If you sort of feel tomorrow we should go back to anything, please feel encouraged to make us to.